Good evening and welcome to this very special episode of NDTV Dialogues. We're a conversation of ideas, and who better to discuss ideas with than this distinguished panel tonight. I'm joined by the world's most prominent welfare economist, Nobel Laureate Professor Amartya Sen. I'm also joined by the chair of NITI Aayog, Dr. Rajiv Kumar from Oxford, also earlier the Center of Policy Research. Thank you both very much for joining us. And Professor Amartya Sen, I think you always create headlines when you're in India.
Oh gosh, no.
And the latest headline is because you said that India has taken a quantum leap in the wrong direction since 2014. That, of course, is when the Modi government took over. Why did you say that?
Well, primarily because it did take a leap in the wrong direction. No, I think there were problems with the previous government's performance. I've been critical of all Indian government's policies, some more so than others. And there were certain corrections that were needed. And I thought particularly at that time, I would say three things. One, there was India, unlike the rest of the world, relied even for first of all, neglected primary health care, but also went for private care in a way that no country in the world, not America, not Europe, not Japan, not Korea, had done. Mm-hmm. And as people like Kenneth Arrow and how others have shown, you cannot, given the asymmetry information, a patient doesn't know certain things that a doctor does know. You can't do it through a market economy at all. And India made a big turn wrong there. I expected to be corrected there. Instead of that, the hold of the private sector has increased. That's a leap, I think, in the wrong direction. I thought that we could say that there were some uncertainties in their life. This is not economics. Uncertainties in the lives of people, Dalits, minorities to some extent, already in 2014. And what was needed was to correct that. Instead of that, I think it's become much more uncertain. So much that the Supreme Court, yesterday even said that the mobocracy, or whatever term they use, has become very dominant. People feel insecure. And the Muslims and Dalits have particularly been victims of such organized killing. And in this, a government has to take responsibility. After all, the central government is important. 22 states are run by the same party as the central government. And I think that was something which I expected I hoped things to improve and didn't. And that was a leap in the wrong direction. And I think I would add to it, since I'm an academic, and Rajiv is an academic too, in background, and I've known him since his student days in St. Stephen's and then in Oxford. I think, Rajiv is a government servant. I don't expect him to agree with me, but I don't think there has been a successful academia in the world without giving it autonomy. Mm-hmm. But the government seems to have been moving in completely the wrong direction, even abolishing the University Grants Commission, having something, I've forgotten, what is it called, like Higher Education Commission.
Yes.
And out of the 12 commissioners, only 2 will be academic. This is laughable, really. I don't think I've taught in various places, Oxford, Cambridge, London, Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford. I've never seen anything like that. So
well, I said what was interesting was that as soon as you said that, and you've actually outlined 3 major areas which are areas of concern for you, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, of course, heads the government's action tank or think tank, the NITI Aayog, said immediately that I'd like to challenge Professor Amartya Sen to actually prove it. So, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, it's over to you, because he has proved his thesis in 3 different areas, or has outlined his thesis in 3 different areas. I'll hand it over to you now.
No, Sonia, thank you, and thank you
for accepting the challenge.
For accepting the challenge, and as you've been my teacher, so I can't contest you except on facts, and that's what I'll try and do.
Absolutely.
You see, in economics, our GDP growth 2012 to 13 was 6.4%, now it's 7.3 for the last 3 years, the average. Our current account deficit is lower. Our fiscal deficit was 5.3%, it's now 3.3%. The foreign direct investment that we got was 36.05 billion, now it's 61.9 billion. Our consumer inflation, which hurts the poor the most, and which is what should be of concern to Professor Sen, was 10%, and now it's 3.5%. And we have, for the first time, this government had the courage to give a statutory requirement to our RBI and made it completely autonomous to target inflation, so that it never is more than 4%. And no other government had previously, done that. They talked about it. And on the thing about health, as you said, the fact is that the expenditure on health, if you count states and central government together, is now 1.6%. But more importantly, Professor Sen, some of our poorer states, because of the monies, again, this is a courageous step taken by this government, that they allowed the Finance Commission to devolve not 31 but 42% of the tax revenues to these states, which has given them the huge sort of space, as it were, to increase. And I have just these figures that Bihar increases its health spending by 65% in FY17, Chhattisgarh by 51%, and Jharkhand by 36%, and Odisha by 25%, because they got the fiscal space given to them by the central government. Moreover, you would know, for example, for surely, that we have now launched Ayushman Bharat, which for the first time in the history of this country is going to cover 10 crore households, 500 million people with the health insurance cover of 5 lakh rupees per year. So the health thing that you're talking about, yes, we have nothing to be proud of, but this government has recognized that and has taken the steps to to do this. On education, you talked about the autonomy. This is the only government that has passed an IIM Autonomy Act, and this is the government which is now talking about institutes of eminence, 20 of them, with whom they have given complete autonomy, not 20 of them, complete autonomy based on their credentials. And we have replaced the whole system. We have replaced the whole system of gradation by an autonomous accreditation body. And you just talked about the UGC being abolished and replaced by the Higher Education Commission. This has been the recommendation of 3 previous committees set up by the previous governments also, because UGC has been mired in all sorts of rent-seeking practices. They have not been focusing on the job that they were supposed to be doing, which is curriculum improvement and faculty improvement, etc. So what would you expect?
And the involvement of academics.
Just 1 second, just one thing more.
Okay.
The MCI, the Medical Council of India, which is supposed to improve the quality of health education. Again, people were totally corrupt body. The government has a bill in the parliament today on the National Medical Commission, which has gone through and which will replace the MCI with professionals and with medical doctors which are nominated and elected, partly elected, so as to change the entire system of health education in this country. Never before has so many steps been taken.
You have to give me the chance to speak.
Yes,
of course. So I was suggesting let's break down these answers so the people who are watching can also understand this better. Let's start specifically with health and the point you made. Yes, go ahead. You want.
I mean, first of all, you said UGC. The previous government, some people may have recommended they abolish it, but they had the wisdom not to abolish it. UGC has quite a history here, going back to Radhakrishnan in the late 40s, and then we had Kothari Commission, and it is in the mode in Britain, in Europe, and in many ways to the major American universities as well. These are not run by the state. And you say that, perfectly objective and so on. I mean, some institution like the GEO has already been determined to be an institution of eminence, even though it's not even in existence.
It doesn't have the land yet.
In Indian public,
there's not a building on the land.
Might be forgiven to have some skepticism about whether you can judge an institution that doesn't exist, whether it is very eminent or not. So I think what you said, and I like that you said that, Rajiv, because it's very important from your side to present all the things as you see it that have been done in the present government. The question is what has been achieved through all the things that you mentioned. Now, as far as the growth and the transformation of the economy is concerned, the big transformation, you asked me, are there any other period of 4 years in
with
which,
so much reforms, with as many reforms?
Well,
That's what I
think of 1991 to 91 to be major reform, and that was done by Manmohan Singh's government.
So
and then let me finish.
Sorry.
And similarly, when you ask for economic growth, you're right that if things go at 7%, 7.4, you end up getting what was the same as the UPA 2, that is 7.2%. But the UPA 1 did 8.4%. That was a higher period. So it's not the case. There are no other 4 years which outmatches this. I mean, in 2014, Indonesia and us were in the same level of lowness. They were 38, we were 38. They're still 38, we are 30. These are what I mean by quantum jump in the wrong direction. And without denying any of the things that you mentioned, we have to see the overall impact of what's happening.
You see, Professor, then you will surely accept that HDIs, and health outcomes, etc., take time to change. Now, as far as inputs are concerned, I have just outlined to you that the state governments, and I request you again to look at the expenditure done by the states on health, on different forms of health, and then combine it with the states. And I think you will find, yes, there has been an irrevocable sort of increase in out-of-pocket expenditures over the last 60 years, as it were. And this is, and this is now being arrested by the health insurance scheme that we just come up with as a recognition of that. And this will be launched by August 15th. And for the first time ever, you will find that the poor people don't slip back into poverty because of medical emergencies.
I just want to ask about it.
Let me just
okay,
I do want to say something, which is that, you see, on the macro situation, it cannot be anybody's case that you had a macro stability of the kind that we have today, along with growth and with inclusion, and with a huge amount of expenditure on inclusionary, on inclusion schemes. Now, I was in the government in between 91 to 95, so I know exactly, and that government had lost its reform appetite by 94, and I was still there. If you look at the reform that this government has done, which is the GST, which is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, which is the RERA, the Real Estate Regulation Act, which is the Benami Act, which is the and I can carry on, the direct tax.
But Professor Kumar, since you've been in the government for so long, you will realize that many of those bills were UPA bills which were blocked by the current government. So I think that's slightly unfair to say that these bills weren't born in 2014.
No, they were not born. But this government had, if you like, either you could say the pragmatism,
the political mandate,
the pragmatism, or the will and the courage to take these. Some of these bills that have been passed, including the GST, are in some sense directly against the so-called constituencies of this government, but they've had the courage to do so. Now, but just the last one on GEO. GEO being now recognized as an institute of eminence is because that foundation, chaired by no less than Professor Ramesh Mashelkar, who is the fellow of the National Science Academy, he is the chancellor of that. They have committed to give it 9,500 crore. They have an 800 crore acre land in Navi Mumbai to which they will do it, and they have identified the vice chancellor as well. So the thought here presumably was that there could be one startup which could set, as it were, the benchmarks for the others, and they have selected the others, as you know, from the existing public and private institutions. But I don't think
I hear what you're saying.
But it's not the reforms undertaken and the schemes targeted to the poor. For example, giving 60 million LPG connections to the poor, or distributing 300 million.
I think you're mentioning all the...
But I think the irony is, and I do have to say this with Professor Sen, sitting here, that we're talking about the GEO Institute, and it may well be an institute of eminence. Let's see what happens. But we also had the Nalanda University, which was meant to be an international university of eminence, even without this tag, which was meant to be across South Asia, which presumably because Professor Amartya Sen was involved in it, was the kiss of death for it under the NDA government. He left, and then after that it has just gone into virtual cold storage. So the sense, I mean,
Sonia,
how can a geo-institute
Sonia, you would have to ask Professor Sen.
But I have to say the double standards seem a little odd here.
No, not at all. But you have to ask Professor Sen himself about the performance of the Nalanda University in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
so, I mean, the point is not this.
Rajiv,
let's not get into this.
Let's get into this. Because, every step that we tried to take was blocked by the government at that time.
But that
not
was
just for me.
government.
Not just for me. My successor was George Yeo, very distinguished person from Singapore. He had been in the board earlier. He had been the foreign minister of Singapore. He tried to get certain things done. He got no reply. No reply from the ministry, no reply from anyone in the government.
Yeah.
So the government can't fly in the face of the totality of information that there is and then suddenly decide to take a jump.
Professor Sen, you continue
in what we think a wrong direction.
You continue to talk only about health. And I think this is very unfortunate because you don't look at all the other things that the government has done on inclusion, on improving the lot of the poor. I mean, it was the previous government which in some sense had a faith in the Washington consensus and was privatizing whatever was supposed to be done by the government and by the inefficient delivery of public services. This is the government which has taken so many reforms.
No, I know that.
No, but let me now complete. You see, this is the government which has opened 300 million bank accounts and has used the JAM Trinity to direct the poor, with its public services and with all the benefits, so that they reach the poor directly. This is the government which is also which is now done. Which is trying to put in place a development state in place of a soft state or a crony state,
but that's the language.
No, it's not the language. It's the reality. Because if you see in schemes after schemes after schemes, whether it is the LED schemes to distribute the bulbs, whether it is there to improve the PDS, whether it is there to give them connections, LPG connections, or electrification of households. 40 million of them have been done. All of those have been done by this government to try and improve, the benefits of the poor. And on the autonomy of the education institution, there is a tiered approach to granting them autonomy. It wasn't done by the previous government.
No, that's not the case.
It is
you
the case.
have chosen a few to which you have given an autonomy.
We hadn't
How
passed
many
the IM
universities
autonomy.
does India have?
Sorry?
How many universities
About
do we
600.
have? Huh?
Yeah.
And how many of them have any autonomy?
The top 30 which have done the NAC grade A+, and there is now for the first time an objective criteria and not a subjective bias for somebody in the government. There is an objective criteria to give them autonomy.
I don't think we can argue that entirely yet that is objective, because there are still many questions being raised about the question of how it was given.
The system has been set up for the first time,
but let me just also
and
ask,
which has never been done before.
Let me also ask Professor Kumar, because you've been talking about inclusion and etc. You talked about electrification of villages. I think the fact remains also that the electrification, as your own figures show, that a major percentage was done in previous governments, which could be from the NDA Vajpayee government to UPA 1 and UPA 2. The finishing line was done by this government. So again, I think you can't claim these 4 years for that. But the issue of inclusion, because you kept saying that, but the one point we haven't addressed is what Professor Sen said on what he feels is the worsening situation of Dalits and minorities in the last 4 years. So when you talk of inclusion, how can we include exclusion in that?
Any data from anywhere, and this is where we slip into very cleverly into the political debate, etc., which I will not get into, because that's not my concern. But the fact is that this government has done the most non-discriminatory approach into its own inclusion policies. I mean, nobody can tell me that the 300 million accounts that were open only for particular segments of the population, or the fact that you had given under the Saubhagya scheme, that you improved the lot of the households that were given only for a particular.
So you're saying Vikas is actually blind to issues. It is
and the fact, as Gurcharan Das writes today in the Times of India, the growth with development and inclusion, and higher growth with development and inclusion, and not just a sort of approach towards entitlement without any growth, is the key, and that's what the government is focused upon. And therefore, the infrastructure.
Where is the data, Professor Sen, to prove your thesis that Dalits and minorities are being left out?
Well, there are three things here. First of all, I was talking about fear and lynching. And who do I call for evidence? The Supreme Court of India? Would that do? Mobocracy and the threatened lives of people who are insecure, and that's primarily, 86% of them have been Muslims, and a high of the remainder Dalits. These are exact statistics that exist. That's one kind of thing. Now, there is a question of how many accounts you open. There is a way of losing your path to clear thinking by looking at individual numbers rather than seeing what has been on the whole achieved. You mentioned, you also made a remark about I should spend more time in India. I do spend a fair amount of time in India. I was away over the last period of 9 months. I was being treated for cancer, and I couldn't come at that time. Normally, I'm here, so I have to cancel my January, February, December, January, February visit. But I'm now I think I'm in good health, and I had a chance of looking at all those numbers that you're mentioning. You have to judge things by what has been achieved, not by how much I have spent. And then you have to see to whom have they gone.
Do you feel, Professor Kumar, this whole that you should have spent more time in India? You made that remark earlier also when you talked about economists who come from say foreign universities. The reference then was seen as to Raghuram Rajan or to even Arvind Panagriya, your predecessor, and perhaps that economists, perhaps more Swadeshi economists like yourself, are those who have more in touch with ground reality.
I don't know what you mean by Swadeshi, because I also studied in Oxford.
So do you think?
But the question is that what I do resent is people if you like and lots of these sort of.
You said that color of foreign influence, especially Anglo-American, on the Indian policy-making establishment that came in the last few decades is fading away. Raghuram Rajan has already left. So Anglo-American, I presume would include Professor Amartya Sen in that. Raghuram Rajan,
I think you're getting into contentious ground. This is about a year.
No, this is a column you wrote.
This is about a year ago that I wrote that, and I stand by it. And I do feel that we have suffered a lot because of looking at the Indian reality through Anglo-American lenses. Can I complete, sir? And the fact that we have used those paradigms to judge ourselves and to judge whatever has happened in the ground. Now, and I don't think that is required, because I think we should be steeped in the realities here and find solutions which are which are amenable, or which the Indian reality demands, rather than ask us to behave in sort of as if we were an advanced economy and so on. Now, for example, just to say,
can he just respond to that? Just come back to you.
But one particular statistics. The fact that you've now constructed 7.5 crore of toilets in this country, and you have cleaned up the rural hygiene, and therefore the chances of your children getting the diarrhea and all the waterborne diseases, isn't that an outcome that is meant for the entire poor? And is that discriminated against? Why don't we talk about that for our change?
Professor Sen, you want to respond, and I'll ask.
I think the bigger issue that Rajiv is raising about foreign people giving advice, this is an eminently discussable issue. I happen to think that Raghuram Rajan is one of the finest economists in the world. But, he can say that nevertheless, we want people who are basically ground reality here. I don't agree with that, though I'm also based here, and I would invite Rajiv as someone I've known from student days to come to my home in Shantiniketan and have breakfast with me with puffed rice and milk and banana, and we can talk about all these things. The fact is, you mentioned isolated fact, the toilet. Bangladesh still has an enormously higher proportion covered with toilets than India has. So I think that, that's also a fact. So what you have to do is not just to say, we built this, we built that. What is the total achievement you have? Bangladesh has close to 100% immunization, which we don't have. I think these big gaps remain. And I think what you are doing, and I admire that, your job is as a NITI Aayog head, or deputy head, but formerly the acting head, is to give the best picture. I think, if I may, as an old friend, say that it's also right for you to think about what are the ways in which it hasn't really worked. And there is a propaganda division of a government, which is, that's whatever the old name is, agit-prop and so on. Governments have done a lot of things this kind in the past.
But
And every government does
let me
that.
ask you, Professor
But
Sen.
yours is a research position, and I'm not being critical of you in the way that you were suggesting that I should come and spend more time in India. I'm saying that I respect your position particularly, and you, because you have an interest in research, and these are research about what is the state of the poor in India, despite all the bank accounts, all these little things that you're talking about, the toilets that you talk about.
But may I just,
and the
Sonia,
picture is
but let me just ask Professor Sen, because if you term that question differently, and the whole question of what, say, Rajiv Kumar and the BJP would say is a propaganda anti the government. The fact is, India can't change in 4 years. It's not that they can transform either in building toilets or in creating hospitals in the short time they've had so far. Is there a propaganda also which is working against the current government? Do you feel, are your views colored by the fact that you may not agree with the political views of this government at all? In fact, the latest poverty report, the World Poverty Clock, shows that now extreme poverty is actually in Africa. India has done remarkable work in coming out of poverty.
Only 5.7% people now, according to the Brookings and the World,
I think
in absolute. No, Professor Sen.
So are you not focusing on the good achievements
Should
of
I
this
be
government?
allowed to answer that question or
And
not?
it's a question which you should
I hope I
appreciate.
get the time.
No, but it's a question which you should
absolutely.
appreciate.
No, absolutely. Please do.
Is your narrative colored, sir?
My job as a critical economist is to criticize anything that I think is wrong. I did with the previous government. If you want to see Manmohan Singh saying, Amartya criticizes us, but he doesn't take this into account or that into account, you can see the film on me that was made by Suman Ghosh with the present film directorate banned until certain words like Gujarat were taken out of it. That's the extent of the individual freedom that we have in the democracy of India. Happily, with one exclusion, namely Gujarat, and reference to the riots of 1992, it is now available. You could see Manmohan defending against my criticism. I criticize what I think is wrong. At the moment, there are many things that are wrong, and I was lamenting the fact that certain things that I would have expected to have been remedied have not been expected, and there have been a jump backwards. So that's what I was talking about. And if I have to point out that not only Thailand, or Indonesia, but Bangladesh is doing better than us in immunization, in toilets, in life expectancy. Bangladesh used to have 2 years lower life expectancy than us. Now it has 2 years higher than us. So in this change that's happened, various governments have played a role. But the present government has certainly worsened the very unfortunate things that were happening and which needed remedy. And there were some remedies, but not adequate. But instead of remedying, we seem to have taken a leap in the direction of exclusion.